All right, I think we've got everybody here. We'll give folks just a minute to hop on, but welcome to Shirley's Kitchen Cabinet's first Kitchen Cabinet Strategy Forum. We are going to give folks just a couple more minutes. We're waiting on one more panelist. So as we wait, I want to take a moment to thank you for joining us today for this very important discussion with some great leaders in the community, in politics and law and government doing their thing. We're excited to have them on board. My name is Michelle Watley. I am the founder of Shirley's Kitchen Cabinet, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to amplifying the voices and power of Black women through education and advocacy so that they can be better advocates on behalf of the issues that matter to them and those communities that they serve. As you could probably guess, Shirley's Kitchen Cabinet is named for the one and only Shirley Chisholm. Just take a moment, let that soak in. Shirley Chisholm, all of her greatness, everything that is her, the first Black woman to be elected to Congress, the first Black woman to run for president on a major party ticket, the Black woman who we know coined the saying, if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. And so today we are bringing our folding chairs and building our own tables with leaders that we have, like all of the great women, and there will be one man if we can get him on board, to ensure that we can advocate on issues that matter to us. So part of the reason why we named it Kitchen Cabinet also is to pay homage to a role in government and politics and strategy that most people don't hear about, and that is the kitchen cabinet. No, we do not make kitchen cabinets, and no, we do not cook. The political kitchen cabinet is the group of advisors, resource providers, strategists, people with the money who come together and help drive agendas and build out the strategy, whether it be for candidates or issues, long before it ever gets before the public. Those of you who have run for office probably know what this is about. You've had a kitchen cabinet, and if you've had a kitchen cabinet, you know that those are the true decision makers. And Black women need to be at that decision-making level. Black women have led movements for eons. Black women have led the charge on some of the movements shaping our nation today. It was Black women that led the Black Lives Matter movement. It was Black women who led the Me Too movement. It is Black women that have got people elected in places like Alabama, where candidates were about to lose. Black women have been responsible for driving social and political change, and therefore, and thereby are more than equipped from where they sit to lead and be at the core decision-making table. So we want to give you a taste of what it means to be at the kitchen cabinet table by bringing together some of the best, the brightest, the most experienced leaders across the spectrum to talk about something that's very important: Black women, the courts, and our vote. So today, we will have a panel of those experts from all different spaces, talk about the different issues through a list of questions that we've already developed, and we will open up the forum for people to ask questions during a Q&A session. If you have questions, be sure to put them in the chat. We'll get to as many as possible. And at the conclusion of our strategy session, you will get a strategy packet that will outline all the resources, key terms, and next steps you need to make informed decisions, not only when you go to the ballot on November 3rd, but beyond. So with that, I want to turn it over to Councilwoman, Kansas City, Missouri Councilwoman, Raina Parks Shaw. We will give each panelist just a couple minutes to introduce themselves, to brag on who they are and the great things that they bring to the table, and then we'll dive right in with questions.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for that introduction, and thank you to Shirley's Kitchen Cabinet for putting this on, and for your strategy forum leads and all of your hard work to bring this necessary information to us. So why don't we go ahead and start with introductions of our panelists. So Pamela, you are first on my screen, so why don't you go ahead and take a few minutes to introduce yourself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So first of all, thank you to Shirley's Kitchen Cabinet for this opportunity. I am Pamela Merritt, and I am the co-founder and co-director of Repro Action, which is a national organization that leads bold action to increase access to abortion and advance reproductive justice. Prior to co-founding Repro Action in 2015, I was the communications director for Progress Missouri. And prior to that, I worked at the statewide for Planned Parenthood advocates and affiliates in Missouri as their online data and data coordinator. So I have been a reproductive justice activist for some 15 years, and I'm very happy to be here and lend my thoughts and advice to this discussion.
Thank you so much, Pamela. Kimberly Norwood, would you go next, please?
Okay. Let's make sure. Can you hear me? Good. So I want to thank you for inviting me to participate in this panel. I just have been really excited about it. So I'm glad to be here, making new friends too. My name is Kimberly Norwood, and I'm a law professor at Washington University School of Law in St. Louis. I've been on the faculty for 30 years. And my primary work falls into three major categories: bias, particularly implicit bias, although we need to sort of add explicit these days. I do a lot of work in colorism, and I do a lot of work in racial disparities in discipline in public schools. I have two books out. One deals with colorism, another deals with Ferguson related issues, Ferguson fault lines. And I'm currently working on a third book with a colleague at Duke Law School on angry Black women. Good to be here.
Okay, thank you so much, Kimberly. And Judge John R. Gray, would you go next, please?
Thank you, Councilwoman, and good evening to everyone. I want to thank Michelle Watley for inviting me to participate. My name is John R. Gray. Presently, I'm a partner in the Kansas City law firm of Shook, Hardy, and Bacon. Before joining Shook, I served as a circuit judge on the Jackson County Circuit Court for a little over 20 years. Before going on the bench, I served as the Democratic attorney for the Board of Election Commissioners of Kansas City, Missouri. This topic is particularly important, particularly timely. I have spent some of my time in the past several weeks offering informational sessions to church groups regarding voter education. Earlier this week, I completed a short video for the League of Women Voters on voting in Missouri. And I'm proud to say that I went and voted the first day that absentee voting was available. It's a pleasure to be with you. Pleasure to meet the panelists virtually and to see panelists again that I've seen before. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Judge Gray. And finally, Kim Gardner.
I think you should say last but least. No, I'm the circuit attorney of the city of St. Louis. It's an honor and a pleasure to be on the panel with everybody, particularly Kimberly Norwood, Pamela Merritt, as well as Honorable Judge Gray. A little intimidating, but hopefully I can lend my perspective as the first African-American circuit attorney of the city of St. Louis and a reform-minded prosecutor female that is a growing trend of new prosecutors that have been post-Ferguson. So hopefully I can add to this valuable discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, before we dive into questions, I want to just take a moment to give our viewers an opportunity to let us know you're here. So obviously the main reason why we're doing this is we want to make sure that all voices can be heard at the ballot box no later than November the 3rd. So I want to ask you to put in your chat or put in your comment section if you have a plan to vote. So state, I have a plan or I have voted in your comment box, and let us see who is here with us today, because that is the number one goal that we want to accomplish, is to make sure that everyone can be an educated voter by November the 3rd. So if you'll go ahead and put that into the comment section, our Facebook viewers, please ensure that you do that. And so we're going to go ahead and jump right in with questions. And we're going to start off to level set to ensure that we are all speaking from the same understanding. So Kimberly, can you start, Kimberly Norwood, I'll have to remember to state last names here. Can you explain the difference between implicit and explicit bias and how it shows up in our courts and legal systems?
Whoa, okay, that's a pretty loaded one. I've been trying to think of how to capture this. So explicit is really deals with a conscious awareness of what you're doing. And implicit really is this thing that happens and you're not even involved with the decision. It actually manifests, and unless somebody points it out to you, you may not even know that you've engaged in this disparate behavior. So I'll give you two recent examples both involving judges. In one case, there's a judge out of Pennsylvania who was trying a drug case, and apparently, I guess the defendants got off, and he then scolded his prosecutor in his chambers. And one of the questions he asked the prosecutor was, "Why did you leave that Aunt Jemima on the jury? Now she's going to go home and celebrate with her baby daddy." So that's kind of explicit. Right, right? Like that's an example of explicit bias, right? Now compare that to another judge who was accused of, Black judge, by the way, the second one, the first one was a white judge, but the second judge, Black judge, was accused by a white criminal defendant of treating him differently in sentencing than he had done with prior Black defendants. And the judge was really sort of grappling with that, struggling with that, went back and looked at all of his prior rulings. And what he found, to his complete surprise, was that he was actually harder on Black defendants in identical situations than white defendants. And he had been doing this for 20 years and didn't even realize it. So that's an example of something that you're doing and you don't even really sort of have consciousness that you're actually doing it, and what you're doing hurts people, right? And so we are now, and for a long time, we've been sort of swimming in the implicit bias waters. Explicit was under control for a while, but post-Trump, it has been, post-2016, I guess, it has really flown off the rails. And so now we're sort of grappling with both of those situations. This shows up in every facet of human life, including the court system. And so you can pull any example and you will find examples of both implicit and explicit bias. We could look at how judges, who they hire, like do they have a diverse staff? We could look at how they treat jurors, how they treat attorneys, lawyers, how they treat witnesses, how they treat parties, how they treat jurors, particularly in the Batson challenge, preemptory challenge area. Jurors come in with their own biases, right? We have laws that have biases. I mean, the most famous example is probably the discrepancy between crack and powder cocaine, right? Where there was just, incredible differences in the sentences for those two drugs. We also have examples where you can have a law that looks racially neutral, but it actually is enforced in ways that penalizes one group over another. So at every level, I mean, sentencing, juveniles, at every level, we see bias impacting, often negatively, what happens in our court system.
I think that you make some excellent points, which actually leads me to Judge Gray. I know as a former judge, you have an intimate understanding of our court systems. Can you talk about the role of courts at the federal, state, and local level? I know Kimberly alluded to some of that, but can you provide some more insight on that, please?
I'll try. Courts are in place to resolve disputes. And whether it's a civil dispute between private parties or a criminal dispute where the state is prosecuting someone for a crime, the idea is that a court system will help bring about an orderly resolution to the problems that citizens bring to the courts. The federal courts, of course, are under the supervision of the U.S. Supreme Court. Federal judges are appointed by the president with the advice and consent of the Senate. State courts here in Missouri, we have two different systems of selecting circuit judges. In the more populous areas, the nominating commission sends 3 names to the governor appoints 1. In the less populous counties, judges run for election as Democrats and Republicans. And of course, municipalities have local court systems that deal with primarily ordinance violations. At the end of the ballot, there will be a number of questions about shall Judge so-and-so be retained in office? And in the system that we use in St. Louis, Kansas City, Springfield, and somewhat around the state for the appellate courts, we have the right to say yes or no. That is, we get a right to decide whether this person should retain his or her office and continue. And that is a candidate list that is very often, it very often escapes the notice or the scrutiny of the public primarily. Some theorize that if the person is doing a good job, I haven't heard anything about them, okay, I'll say yes. Some people have an experience with a specific judge that they didn't like a ruling, and so they say no. And there's even a part of the populace that says no to everything. And so it's important for us as citizens to educate ourselves. I shared with Michelle earlier in the week a publication. There's a survey that's done every time a retention vote comes up. She will share the source of that information, where you can go to find out about judges in your specific jurisdiction.
That is excellent. And I just have to have a moment of transparency because I have my absentee ballot here, but I was saving it until we had this discussion because I am one of those who says, well, I haven't heard anything, so I guess the judge is okay. So I'm so glad that you were able to provide some information about how we can research and become more educated voters, because as we have seen, it matters. It definitely matters. And so thank you for that. I just wanted to be transparent. I do have a plan. I will finish this as soon as I get that research done on these judges. So
happy to talk to you offline.
Okay, well, I'll be texting you. Thank you. So Judge Gray talked about the Supreme Court. And so I want to move now to Pam, because there's been a lot of discussion now about Roe v. Wade, which was established in the Supreme Court. Can you talk about why there's so much discussion now about Roe v. Wade being overturned?
Yes, so thank you for the question. So just to explain that Roe v. Wade is a landmark Supreme Court ruling in January of 1973, exactly 1 month before I was born, that established a right to privacy and specifically the right to privacy between a physician and a patient. There's quite a lot of law that rests on Roe. And so we often talk about it in terms of abortion access and the right to abortion, because that is what was challenged up to the court that they ultimately ruled on. But there's a lot of law that has since been extrapolated from Roe because of the right to privacy. So the reason why we are currently hearing a lot of discussion, debate, and anxiety about the status of Roe is that, to put it quite succinctly, elections have consequences. And in November of 2016, the Trump administration Trump campaign won, and immediately began to implement what they had campaigned on, which is to have a very regressive court, strict, what they like to call originalists, who are interpreting law and the Constitution in a very very conservative way. So outside of the political parameters, what this means is that the law kicks in, and the president of the United States has the right to appoint Supreme Court nominees, to nominate people to the Supreme Court. The Senate has a responsibility to both put them through a committee with due diligence and oversight to make sure that they are qualified to sit on the high court with a lifetime appointment. And then ultimately the Senate will vote on that individual. I think for far too long, the tradition has been to basically go through kind of theater when it comes to reviewing whether or not somebody is fit to sit on the high court. And in the last 3 years, we have seen this president appoint 2 Supreme Court justices, at least one of which I think there's a strong argument was stolen from the Obama administration. The end result is, however, clear, that we currently have a conservative majority on the Supreme Court. And I don't think for the longest time we've had this balance of conservatives and liberals. So the decisions coming out of the court have been somewhat moderate. We saw surprising decisions on ACA, or we saw surprising decisions on marriage equality for same-sex marriage. But when you have a majority either way, then you stop seeing nuanced decisions, and you start seeing that political ideology come through. I just read online some people getting into an argument on Facebook about whether they felt that Roe could fall. The purpose of the Supreme Court is to decide what is constitutional. That's what they do. So this idea that we get into this back and forth where everybody suddenly becomes a constitutional expert and is talking about what is constitutional and not constitutional is very alarming to me. Roe v. Wade certainly could be struck down. And my organization and most reproductive justice activists have been preparing since the Trump administration took power for a post-Roe world. And what that likely will mean is that the access to abortion will be kicked back to the states. And there will be whole areas, particularly in the Midwest and the Upper South, that are abortion deserts where there's just not access. But anybody who thinks that we aren't looking at a potential of Roe being struck down, I would point them gently to look at the Voting Rights Act and to see exactly how mercenary and incredibly precise the Roberts Court has been when they are given the right opportunity to wield their scalpel. And then I'll just finish with the fact that we right now are in the midst of a Supreme Court confirmation process. The president has nominated somebody within a political theater that my colleagues and myself and a lot of people believe it is unacceptable while people are already voting. The election has begun for this president to try to push through another nominee. What we're watching is a power grab, and the people don't grab power if it doesn't matter. So I can't impress upon the attendees enough that the Supreme Court has a huge impact on your life, and particularly on the power and the latitude that like the lower courts can wield in your life. And that on top of that, this president has appointed a historic number of federal judges who will we're lucky if we can get things to the Supreme Court. So important policy and law like voting rights, like discrimination, immigration rights, and reproductive health, including in vitro fertilization and birth control and abortion, are now on the line. And I'm one of those people who's been doing this long enough that, I take no joy in saying that. There will be no happiness in me saying I told you so, but we are definitely organizing to try and mitigate the damage, because with a majority conservative court, that puts you in a position of not being able to stop a lot of this.
Okay, thank you so much, Pamela. There's been a question that came up. Someone requested mentioning the backgrounds of our panelists. And so I'll just mention Judge John Gray is a former circuit court judge, now a partner at Shook, Hardy and Bacon. Kim Gardner is circuit attorney for the city of St. Louis, Missouri. Pamela Merritt, who just spoke, an activist and co-founder and co-director of Repro Action. And Kimberly Norwood is author and professor of law at WashU. So, I want to move on now to hear a little bit from Kimberly Gardner. Ultimately, what we have found, as we've discussed already, that judges wield a lot of power. And, there's also a lot of power that comes with elected roles that intersect with the courts, the law and law enforcement. Kimberly, can you talk a little bit about what power prosecutors wield and where does that power show up in the lives of Black people? When someone in the Black community, in our Black community, encounters individuals in that position. If you could talk a little bit about that, please.
Thank you. I think it's very important to understand the prosecutor has a lot of discretion. We determine who you charge, what you charge, and when did you charge, or when you create alternatives. And I think that is one thing that people fail to actually, now we're starting to understand the power of a prosecutor. And that started with Ferguson, when we saw how the prosecutor handled the Mike Brown case, how it was presented to the grand jury. And now people are starting to say, well, the prosecutor has a lot of power, because really the judge will not see a case unless a criminal case, unless a prosecutor chooses to charge that case. And so that's where prosecutors, when we look at who your local prosecutor is very important. In 2016, I was one of the rare reform-minded prosecutors that came post-Ferguson that did not exist 5 years ago. And so when we talk about a reform-minded prosecutor, all the things that you asked the panelists in terms of implicit bias and understanding that the criminal justice system has been a part of issues in terms of how Black and brown and poor people are represented more than any other group in the criminal justice system. And you look at the Attorney General's numbers of this state, 1 in 3 African Americans are stopped 90% of the time more than any other group. And in St. Louis City alone, 46%, 45% racial makeup of African Americans to Caucasian Americans and others. And so we look at that breakdown. Well, why is it? By the Ethical Society of Police, and in the city of St. Louis, we have 2 police unions. We have the Ethical Society of Police that represent African American police officers, and then you have the St. Louis Police Officer Association. And so even in their reports, they determined in 2016 that over 80% of the arrests are Black and brown individuals. And so when we look at those arrests, those are the cases coming to our office in terms of how we charge, what we charge. And when we are, as being a reform-minded prosecutor, you have to look at the implicit bias. You have to look at how mass incarceration has decimated our communities. You have to look at how we create alternatives, because one of the things that we've done wrong with the criminal justice system is doing what it's always meant to do. And we have to not only dismantle it, we have to rebuild it to be fair and just for everyone. And we believe as prosecutors, equal justice under the laws. And that's important. And so I think that people really do not understand the power of a local prosecutor. And that's why you have many individuals from the federal level, President Trump, at the local level through Attorney General Eric Schmidt, as well as Governor Parsons, who want to take the discretion of the prosecutor, which, and I want to go back to this because Pamela Merritt hit on it, the local control of abortions. Well, I have the only active working abortion clinic in my jurisdiction. And we passed a law when I first took office. Well, not we, the Missouri legislature passed a law which gives the Attorney General concurrent jurisdiction in terms of violating any crimes dealing with abortion clinics. And that's powerful because that takes away that discretion of that local prosecutor. And that's the new trend, is this prosecutorial discretion is actually very paramount to that local prosecutor. And you want a prosecutor who you can hold accountable every 4 years by voting him or her out if you don't believe the policies of how she implements or he implements cases or reform in your jurisdiction is not to the people's standard, because we are the people's prosecutor. And so when we have these piecemeal types of situations where we saw on the state level that the Attorney General through Governor Mike Parsons tried to take over the local prosecutor's jurisdiction, my jurisdiction, only out of the 115 prosecutors. So I'm one out of 115 prosecutors, and they talk about violent crime. And so we need to make sure that we understand, how do you hold your prosecutor accountable, but what the prosecutor really does. And so that's why it's important when you have laws and individuals who want to inject politics into who you charge, what you charge, and when you have alternative programs, that is also up for this new tough on crime failed rhetoric. Mass incarceration has made all of our communities less safe. And when you hear a lot of the rhetoric that we hear that's led by President Trump, that we have to have federal intervention and we have to help violent crime in democratic cities, those are key words to actually tell a local prosecutor, we're going to do your job for you. And that's inappropriate, because how you investigate and actually charge criminal activity in your jurisdiction, that's the local prosecutor's duty and job. And that is not for political discussion. That's not for political pandering. And actually, we have to understand what is going on. When we had this COVID-19 pandemic, on top of the disparities that we all know, the healthcare disparities, the educational disparities, the social service disparities, and then we top that with this new pandemic that is causing more people to be out of jobs, deaths of unimaginable proportions. But we have leadership in these states that are controlled by certain parties that want to pander fear and divisive rhetoric to distract from what they're doing on every level to address the COVID-19 pandemic. So we use the same Willie Horton approach of the 2020, the future, 21st century, to say, now prosecutors, you're not handling crime in your cities. And it's simply not true. When we talk about violent crime and what perpetuates violent crime, what a reform-minded prosecutor is talking about is getting to the root causes of what drives individuals to the criminal justice system. Is looking at the lack of jobs, the lack of access to equal education, the lack of access to mental health services and social services. And if we fund those things up front, we will have less crime. But we fail to have a strategic plan to address these inequities that we know existed for 100+ years. And now we want to talk about more law enforcement intervention is going to make us safer. That's the same flawed approach that we know that William Barr, if you go back to and Professor Norwood hit it on the head, the crack cocaine disparity, he wrote the book for making the case for more prisons and mass incarceration. And so we're dealing with the effects of mass incarceration that has made all of us unsafe. But until we address common sense gun laws, we address the inequities of the health disparities in communities where people are poor and people of color who are represented more in the criminal justice system, and we address how we address those root causes, simply when a person comes across our desk, that is not the only option of long sentences. So we have to make the community whole. We have to address trauma. We have to address the cycle of victimization that we never addressed. Victim today, perpetrator tomorrow. We have to address the disparities of, one, more African Americans and people of color and poor people are represented in the criminal justice system, not because they're sentenced to long periods of time, because of probation violations that we know is the number one reason why people go to jail. And so until we deal with the inequities, we're going to have the revolving door that we know we spend more money of our budget to incarcerate, but we don't give that same person that $30,000 a year it takes to incarcerate you to education, to those health disparities, that if we got that $30,000 up front, then I bet you we'll have less people going through the revolving door of the criminal justice system.
Excellent point, and thank you so much. I want to take a second to just remind our viewers and those in the chat to put your questions in the chat box, or our viewers on Facebook to put your questions in the comment section so that we can get to the questions. We're going to open it up here shortly. I want to just go back to something you said, Kim. You talked about as a prosecutor, the importance of being a prosecutor. Well, Senator Kamala Harris has often been criticized for her tenure as a prosecutor. Kentucky Attorney General Cameron Daniel led the investigation and presented the case to the grand jury in the Breonna Taylor case, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, where, of course, they were found not guilty of murder charges. Even with Black leaders at the helm of law enforcement, we don't always see change in the system. What are some of the challenges that Black leaders see taking on these roles? Is there someone that wants to address that? And how can we overcome those challenges?
Well, I can start off. Well, I mean, first of all, we have to understand the role that prosecutors play and hold that person accountable. I mean, we have elected officials like that we named the Kentucky Attorney General. We have many examples. And what we have to understand is the real issue is not just what decision that one prosecutor made at that one incident, which we all can say there's issues with that decision. But we have to understand that as prosecutors, we have a lot of hurdles. And one of the hurdles we have police unions and we have prosecutors who have been around for 20 plus years who have never charged police officers with a crime, and they still are in these offices. And so when you have individuals like myself, a reform-minded change agent prosecutor who looks at holding all people accountable regardless of your occupation, then you get the backlash that we've seen in examples at me, where you have the police union who is one of the most egregious aggressions, the St. Louis Police Officers Association union in the country, per the Washington Post. With this, you have individuals that are able to negotiate and collective bargaining agreements, hide behavior of bad apples in the police department, not understand the ramifications of what mistrust with the criminal justice system does in terms of how a prosecutor can hold violent individuals accountable. But what we have to say is, how can we make it more transparent and accountable that these collective bargaining agreements are basically put out to the public so the public can vote, because we're paying for those civil actions that even Breonna Taylor's example that the city had to pay up. And that is our tax dollars working. So when you know that our money is going to issues of police accountability, we need to make transparent that collecting bargaining agreement, which right now in the city of St. Louis, they're negotiating. And Jeff Rorta, per the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, which I don't like to quote the Post-Dispatch, they're saying that they're in negotiations, but it's in back doors. And so it's for the public to make it public, because your money is paying for these judgments that are sometimes even hidden from the prosecutor, because they have clauses where they cannot even release these judgments. And so sometimes we don't even know about some judgments on police officers. So the first thing is, we have to make the collective bargaining agreement transparent to everybody so we all can see. We have to have these clauses that are no negotiation. Police accountability in terms of how you can take a bad apple off the police department needs to be voted on by the public, because it's our tax dollars working regardless. And second of all, there needs to be support for the prosecutor. Like myself, I implemented the first exclusion list that I've been in suits multiple times by the police union, because when you have the ability as a police officer to take someone's life or liberty, you have to be trustworthy and credible. So that's important. And if you saw, most people around the country, even police chiefs around the country, supported that. But why did our police union, and you never heard anything with the police department, did they not champion this? Because it's needed. This is about the integrity of the whole system. And when you want the system to work fairly and justly and equal for everyone, these things need to be in place. But for us to think that somehow bias and systemic racism, the police department is immune from this, then I think we haven't been living in life, because unfortunately our whole country is made up of the systemic racism and inequities that we know existed for decades and centuries. And we have to understand, and that's where a reform out of prosecutors saying that we need to be a part of systemic change. We need to be a part of making changes and recognizing that there has been biases, recognizing there has been issues, and we have to address them in a fair and just manner. But when we have to start with the open proposition that no longer can you have elected prosecutors who do not hold police accountable like everyone else. And that's local voting.
I think so. One of the things that you mentioned, I want to move to Judge Gray now to talk a little bit about the grand jury process, because you know that is confusing for many of us. Can you talk about how grand juries are formed and how they determine if justice is served in a case like the Breonna Taylor case?
During my tenure, I had the opportunity once to select a grand jury. And a grand jury is convened. Sometimes they serve for 6 months, sometimes they serve for a year. It depends from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But the grand jury hears allegations from the prosecutor. The grand jury doesn't find people guilty or not guilty. They decide whether to indict someone for a crime. And when they choose to take a case before the grand jury, the only persons present are the members of the grand jury and the prosecutor. And the prosecutor gives the grand jury the information that the prosecutor wants to give. Our brother down in Texas came out and said that the grand jury heard all of the evidence. Well, we're finding out now that that may not be true, that there are some members of the grand jury who want to talk about their experience. They're prohibited from doing so, but they've asked for permission to talk about their experience. And so a prosecutor, the old saying goes, a prosecutor should be able to get an indictment even against a ham sandwich, because the prosecutor gives whatever information the prosecutor wants to give to the grand jury and recommends that they return an indictment or they not return an indictment. And this is important because a grand jury supposedly provides political cover. If a prosecutor doesn't want to charge, they'll take a case before a grand jury. They'll tailor that case. It's just like the butcher. They can cut it long or cut it short, and in essence, lead the grand jury to the decision that the prosecutor wants to be the result in the case. And it's wrapped at times with this veneer of credibility and legitimacy, when in fact, the grand jury only hears what the prosecutor wants them to hear. It's very rare, it's extremely rare for a defendant to go before a grand jury and tell their side of the story. Curiously, in the Michael Brown case, the police officer went to the grand jury, the same police officer that didn't write a report of what had happened. He went to the grand jury, and of course, he was able to present his defense, and we don't know how much or how little the prosecutor put on as a case. And as a result, there was no indictment. So those are the things that take place in front of a grand jury.
Thank you for that clarification, Judge Gray. Juries,
Can I say just real quick about the grand jury, and I know Judge Gray has a different perspective, but that's why local prosecutors are very important, because how you handle that grand jury is also that prosecutor's accountable, and you can unelect that person. So I know there's many stuff that say that we can indict a ham sandwich. Actually, if you use the grand jury appropriately, it's not as easy as most people think. In the city of St. Louis, it's not as easy, but he's articulating how issues in how the grand jury was used in Michael Brown, which some can say that led to the unelection of Bob McCullough. And I think that's where that local control is very important, because if there's a case like in Kentucky that people disagree, well, they can vote that person out. So I just want to make this not where it can be used many different ways, but actually, like the judge is saying, is one step in many processes of the court process. And that's where understanding these processes are so important.
Can I just jump in 1 second? just a slightly different angle on it, which is that in our work as reproductive justice advocates who are working within marginalized communities, and specifically with Black women and communities, I've got to say that we need to demand a different relationship with law enforcement. And that is why I think it's important to begin the debate of whether to defund the police or reconstitute the police. My reasoning behind that is that every dialogue we have, which Kim mentioned, is as if law enforcement is inflicted upon communities, as opposed to them being public servants who serve the public and are supposed to adhere to the Constitution. The number 2 complaint of bad behavior from law enforcement is sexual assault and harassment. That as consumers, which is what the public is, consumers should be able to call law enforcement and not fear that they are going to be faced with the threat or intimidation of sexual assault and violence, or the reality of it. It's the second most common complaint. And yet, time and time again, not only do we struggle to get that information from law enforcement agencies, but we struggle to get accountability. And I know we're pressed for time, but there are more than one incident in the city of St. Louis where the only reason an officer was brought up on charges is because the press got a hold of a story where this was a slam dunk conviction of somebody for sexual assault. And so my issue is that I've never seen the tax-paying public tolerate this kind of rogue behavior from any other agency of the government or any other taxpayer-funded agency. So I think, yes, we need reform-minded prosecutors. Yes, we need to be able to hold people accountable, but we also need to rethink our relationship with law enforcement and not necessarily dismissed people who are talking about defunding the police, because the toll on our communities is huge. And I'm not at all interested in continuing to fund a taxpayer-funded gang, particularly as a feminist, when I see women being treated the way they are by the system and by law enforcement when they're seeking help.
May I interject? May I interject and respond to the question you asked earlier about should people of color be in prosecutorial positions? My philosophy is that institutions of government have to fairly reflect the constituencies that they serve. So we need to be prosecutors, we need to be defense attorneys, we need to be judges, we need to be parole officers and probation officers, corrections officers, up and down the board, not only in the criminal system, but also in the economic development system, the labor system, personnel system, and all these government offices. We need to be present in order to affect policy.
That's right.
I want to jump in real quick want to make 2 comments, one on Judge Gray. I just want to echo what he said about the need for prosecutors of color. I think over 86% or 88% of prosecutors in the nation are white male. That is unbelievable. It's astounding and it's unacceptable. And as Kim Gardner mentioned earlier, the power that the prosecutor wields in terms of what to charge, right? And, if they're going to take a plea, what that looks like, their role, in terms of recommending sentencing, all of these issues are life-changing. And you need people, you need diverse people with diverse experiences, diverse perspectives, making these decisions. In Justice Sotomayor's book, she talks a lot about the importance of prosecutors of color and how many lives she actually saved because she was a prosecutor, in terms of the decisions she made and the paths that she opened for people. The last thing I want to say really quickly to Pam's comment is, I just want to throw out there, this sort of threw through me when I found out this summer, just before the pandemic started. It takes longer to become a cosmetologist, a barber, a hairdresser in Missouri than it takes to become a police officer. Just sit with that.
All right. Point, and we will transition to Michelle, because I'm understanding that we have some comments and questions from Facebook. So go ahead, take it away, Michelle.
We have tons of questions. This has been a robust discussion. I have learned a lot just by listening, and I wish we could do this for 2 hours. This is part of the kitchen cabinet like strategy, is to get the experts to the table and to really deep dive, and this has been great. So we'll ask a couple of questions and then we'll wrap it up to respect the time of the panelists. If we go a little over, panelists are welcome to drop off as they need to, because we gave you all a time commitment. And we will try to get through this as quickly as possible. So we'll just take a couple of questions. We're going to start with Pam. If you could very quickly talk a little bit more about reproductive justice outside of the discussion of abortion. When we think about reproductive justice, it's automatically tied to abortion. Define for us, what is reproductive justice, how it impacts Black women, and why we should be concerned?
My pleasure. So reproductive justice was coined in 93 by a group of Black women who felt that the idea of pro-choice simply did not represent the broad spectrum of their reality. So reproductive justice is a movement that is organizing it's a framework to organize for the human right to determine whether or not to parent, to have the supports from society to parent the families or children that you do choose, and to raise your families in communities that are free of violence and oppression. Basically, as a reproductive justice activist, I'm a human rights activist. And as a Black woman, I'm working to create that reality for everybody. That means that I'm working on gun violence as a public health issue. I'm working on lead paint in our communities with our young people. I'm working on environmental justice, because so much of pollution is hitting poor and working poor families. We're working on housing as a reproductive justice issue, because as we saw in St. Louis with the Clinton Peabody Housing Project, it's directly tied to infant and maternal mortality. We're working on making sure people have access to birth control so that and prevention, so they can plan their pregnancies and be in the best position of health when they are going to have and start a family. And in Missouri, we're working very hard to raise public awareness of and focus on the role racism plays in infant and maternal mortality. And most importantly, well, all of those things are clearly very important to Black women. They're important to me selfishly, and I know they're important to everybody else, but we're also raising the specter of criminalization for pregnancy outcomes, which is something that is a long history of in law enforcement and prosecutorial enforcement against Black women. And with the specter of Roe v. Wade falling, a very real reality that poor women, marginalized women, and people who experience pregnancy will be likely to be targeted for criminalization for drug use while pregnant. There was a woman in the South who was facing prosecution for having the audacity to be shot while pregnant. So when we talk about people being prosecuted for pregnancy outcomes, that's happening now. And that's happening to Black and brown people. It's happening to Native women. And so we need to be very aware that even though the discussion might be about abortion, the reality is that the change in law is often used to expand beyond just the basic theory of abortion all the way into pregnancy outcomes, and people are serving time for that. So thank you for the question.
You're muted, Michelle.
I'm sorry, Judge Gray. It looked like you were going to add to that.
what I want to point out is that traditionally the approach has been to prosecute the physicians who perform abortions. But you recall when candidate Trump was asked, should a woman be punished? His answer was yes. And so
Yes.
this is where the public policy is likely to go if a decision such as Roe is overturned.
And it's also, thank you for bringing that up. It's also important to note that with medication abortion, which is wildly popular and incredibly safe and effective, but with medication abortion, the pregnant person is the provider. So every single law that says that providers will face prosecution, if a person is self-managing their abortion outside of a medical situation, that individual is the person subject to prosecution.
And just to expand that, in Missouri, we created concurrent jurisdiction. So if the local prosecutor, which I have the only actual functioning abortion clinic in the state of Missouri right now, that's where I am charged with looking into potential criminal laws violation related to this very broad bill that was passed, I think about 3 years ago. Is that correct? Pamela, I know you know I don't want to quote the number, but it was when I first took office. And I know that because even it was an unlikely proponent for my discretion was Bob McCullough. You know, I know people like to talk about him, but he actually understood that prosecutorial discretion is crucial. And that's why people need to pay attention to these elections, because that's what is at stake. When they talk about lawlessness and these reform-minded prosecutors, which William Barr has had direct target with President Donald Trump, and Missouri is in the national forefront. I can't go into discussion about a certain case that happened in the city of St. Louis. Well, it's been the benchmark case for how we control prosecutorial discretion. And that's why political pandering.
What is prosecutorial discretion?
It's the prosecutor's discretion of who to charge, what to charge, and when to charge, or given alternatives, deferred prosecution. So that's how we investigate and review criminal activity in our jurisdiction. So that's where you have these laws that we had, I guess, a month ago, that was this crime bill, which was going to give the Attorney General concurrent jurisdiction and looked at murder cases and gave a 90-day kind of window to look at whether I charged a murder case, else they could take the case over. Now, why this is important is there's no statute of limitation on murder. And most murders in the city of St. Louis are unsolved because of two reasons: lack of witness and victim participation and lack of evidence. So when you have these false timelines on cases that have no statute of limitation, there is also an underlying issue. Well, why would the Attorney General want to take over? Well, guess what? The local prosecutor also controls officer-involved shooting cases. Those are considered potentially murder first cases. Someone is dead. So if there's ever criminal charges, they're looking to these different charges. So that will also go to the Attorney General. So you have to look at the underlying, what are some individuals who have a vested interest, the police union, who push these type of legislation, because they don't want the local prosecutor to investigate criminal activity of law enforcement. They want blanket immunity. And that's what you have to be careful with these bills. They have an underlying intent.
Wow. Okay. So we have one more question. We are over time. So again, if any of the panelists need to drop, I will graciously allow you to do so, but we will make this quick, kind of rapid fire. There have been a number of questions in the chat regarding a couple of things. Attorney General Cameron in Kentucky and his refusal to release information, which has essentially in that case led to calls to defund the police. And so I think this is probably something all of you could speak to, but particularly Judge Gray, Kimberly Norwood, and Kimberly Garner. Can you talk about your thoughts on defunding the police, kind of the racial, historic context and undertones? Judge Gray, from your standpoint, what that means in the court system, and Circuit Attorney Gardner, what that looks like for you as a prosecutor. Again, if you could be as concise as possible, because we want to get to kind of some forward moving strategy, and clearly we need to make these longer because, yeah, an hour ain't enough. Go ahead and start with you, Judge Gray.
If I had been asked, I would have come up with a different slogan. Rather than defunding the police, what we're talking about is reallocating resources. If a person is having a psychotic episode, they need someone trained in that discipline to address them, rather than a police officer with a gun whose solution to most things is to shoot. We're talking about bringing more and better and more qualified resources to bear upon the problems that we have, because although policing is visited upon Black and brown people at a disproportionate rate, we are also victims of crime at an alarming rate. And so I don't think we should do away with police, but I do believe that we should reallocate resources, which is what I think the defund the police slogan is speaking to.
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick. I think I agree with the judge wholeheartedly. I don't think most people really are talking about defunding the police, although there are some groups that are, right? I know some scholars that are advocating that, and apparently I think there's a city in New Jersey where that was supposedly done, where it was completely dismantled and rebuilt. But I'm with the judge. I mean, I really think we need to be thinking about doing things differently, right? Reallocating resources, right? The thing I mentioned earlier about the training of police, how long it takes a police officer versus how long it takes to become a barber. That's not nothing. That's a big deal, right? We need to really invest more time in their education, in their training. They're not well paid typically. So there's that, right? I am an advocate of a residency requirement that would require them to live in communities. I am an advocate of having some mental health personnel accompany these officers, because there's so many shootings and aggressive encounters that occur because the law officers are not educated and not equipped to deal with that situation. And the last thing, I mean, there's a whole list of ways in which we can reallocate money for food, for healthcare, for housing, right? For educational programs, all kinds of ways we can find to spend the money that will, as Kim Gardner said earlier, actually reduce crime. Right. And so, but the one thing I want to mention too, real quick on this, in Malcolm Gladwell's book, Talking to Strangers, he spends a lot of time, just a phenomenal book, and he spends a lot of time talking about the Sandra Bland case. And he talks about how police officers in that town in Texas, they do things that they really shouldn't be doing. Like we just sort of have to figure out a different way for you to spend your day, and not sort of sitting around waiting for someone to go 5 miles over the speed limit and then pull them over, right? And then harass them because the light is out and all of these other things, that we're not efficient with the way in which we do this. And so that's another huge part for me in the defund movement.
And just to echo what everybody's saying, I believe that the activist community, this is what I believe, they know, and they've stated that defund the police, like everyone has said on the panel, is not actually to defund the police. It's reallocate and right-size law enforcement and the budget. For example, in the city of St. Louis, the police department has over approximately 358 million of the city budget versus 8.1 million of the prosecutor's budget. So when we talk about right-sizing, if we took some of those resources, which are public safety resources, to fund the inequities of access to healthcare, the social service component that needs to be funded, as well as the things that we know that police officers do not have the infrastructure or the actual education to deal with, then that's where that money is not just talking about defunding, is right-sizing law enforcement, because it's so we as law enforcement need to start the conversation. And I think they put defund the police department, because we defund education all the time. We never talk about that. We defund social services every time. We never talk about that. We defund guns all the time. We never talk about that. And so it needs to be in your face. This is what we do every day. Even in the state of Missouri, we've done it more even with all the issues we have, we chose to defund education, which has a direct link to criminal justice in terms of who goes into the system. School to prison pipeline is real. So when we know this, we have to have these tough words to start the conversation to really understand what it's about. But when we get caught up in semantics, we all know we need to do something different. And I don't care what we need to call it, but let's be about helping our brother's keeper. Because if I get somebody a job, I know for a fact that's what we do in our office. They will stay out the criminal justice system. When I help that individual who's a victim and they're going through trauma, and we get the trauma-informed counseling that we bring inside our office, that helps them not come back and go further down the victimization role, as well as actually involved in a criminal activity. Because people think that victims and perpetrators are different individuals. They're the same person. They're actually three people. They're the defendant, the person who's a victim, as well as witnesses. And we deal with these different roles many different times, and we have to address that.
Yeah, that was powerful. Thank you all very much. I want to make sure that I take a moment to give you your just due and to talk about kind of next steps, because some of the panelists have to jump. I want to thank Councilwoman Raina Parkshaw. When we talk about implicit bias and the role of elected leaders in changing implicit bias, the bias that you don't know about, such as hair discrimination, right? When you come into the workplace and you're policed about the way your hair looks, policy is one way to ensure that that stops, that we have larger cultural shifts. And Councilwoman Raina Parkshaw, along with Councilwoman Melissa Robinson, recently passed the Crown Act, which would make it illegal to discriminate based on hairstyles and textures. That is why it's important to have Black women and Black people in office to represent our needs. And Councilwoman Raina Parkshaw has represented us very well. So thank you so much for your time. She's got to hop because she's a councilwoman. She's working like all of us. So I'm gonna give her a chance to hop off. Thank you again, Councilwoman Shaw. Pamela Merritt is another example of that. Pamela Merritt has been in the fight for reproductive justice for Black women for over 20 years. There are not a lot of Black women in this space, and it's an issue that impacts us. Kimberly Norwood is an author, has spoken internationally about race and racism, implicit bias across the world, because understand, this isn't only happening in America, it happens in a number of other countries. And so she's an expert overseas. Judge John R. Gray has been in the courts for over 20 years and now is a partner at a law firm. Being a partner at a law firm is not easy. There are not many Black partners in law firms. There are not many Black judges. And so if you ever have to run into or were in a position where you were in the courts and you had to face a judge, you might have had the opportunity to come before a Black man who understands your background, your experience, and will apply the law fairly. And same thing with Circuit Attorney Kim Gardner. She won that race, that election, by over 60% in a four-way race. There was a mandate for her to be in office. There is a mandate for her to lead. She is the first Black woman to do so. And to say progressive is an understatement. She has stopped accepting cases from precincts that are having trouble with objectivity and handling their cases appropriately, and has made national news for the work that she's been doing in trailblazing. So I wanted to make sure we were clear on the experts we have at this table, because it's rare for us to bring these folks together. And so I wanted to thank you all and make sure to give you your just due. Okay, so rapid fire, and I'll let you all go. What is one strategy that you would suggest people take forward in this upcoming election and moving onward? And I'll start with Kimberly. When we talk about race and racism, how can we hold our elected leaders and decision makers accountable for addressing that as members of the community? If you could give just some quick, tangible takeaway thoughts on how we can do that.
Well, so I think this is the most difficult thing we will ever do. I really do believe that. I think race is like nothing else. And it's going to take a lot of consciousness and work. And you talk about a marathon, it's really a marathon. We've got to vote. We've got to figure out how to get folks out for voting, because even now we're still having these issues, and we've got to get people to understand, as I think Pam started off with earlier, voting matters. Voting has consequences. And if we've ever not known that, we should know it now, right? And so we've got to get people out to vote. We've got to call these legislators, these elected officials. We've got to let our voices be heard. And quite frankly, we've got to start running for office too. Right? I mean, I think we have to be there. If we're not at the table, we're not at the table, right? And all kinds of decisions are being made, and they're not differences of opinion, thoughts, views, experiences, perspectives to weigh in on issues. And so we've got to do those three things, in my view. Thank you.
All right, Judge Gray, rapid fire, 30 seconds. When people are looking at the ballots in Kansas and Missouri and they see the judges, what do they need to keep in mind on November 3rd? What you should be thinking about or looking for when voting for judges on November 3rd?
Well, they need to educate themselves. You posted the resource that's available for the judicial, not only the lawyer, but also jurors participated in those surveys. And we need to educate ourselves about those things. Professor Norwood's correct. We do need to vote. But after we vote, we need to pay attention to what's going on and be involved and ask our representatives, why did you do that? You know, this isn't what I thought I was voting for you to do. We need to keep an eye on them and hold them accountable each and every day, not just on the election day.
All right, and last but certainly not least, Circuit Attorney Kim Gardner, there are prosecutors on the ballot on November 3rd here in Kansas City, across the state of Kansas and Missouri. When voters go into the ballot booths on November 3rd, what should they be looking for or thinking about when voting for their prosecutor?
Well, the issues we talked about, we're accountable for those decisions. And so please vote November 3rd. I'm actually one of those elected officials that is on the ballot in the city of St. Louis. So please go out and vote, but also know all skin folk ain't kinfolk. I'm just gonna be honest. And so we have to make sure that we hold everyone accountable and we understand their record. And that means, you know, a prosecutor, we have to make tough decisions. That does not mean we make the decisions that everybody agrees with. And most prosecutors are not popular. So please pay attention to what we really can do and not focus on some of this new rhetoric that I see the media gives us blame for a lot of things that actually law enforcement or the investigative agency. So we have to understand the roles.
All right, and with that, we are going to end our kitchen cabinet session. I want to thank Asia Jones, Sandy Thornhill, Brittany Reed, all of our panelists for showing up for us today at Shirley's Kitchen Cabinet. Visit us at www.shirleyskitchencabinet.org and on Facebook at Shirley's KCMO. This video will be there once it's done with live, so you can come back and review it. We will also send a follow-up email with information on where you can find your sample ballots, so you know who's going to be up for election and you can do your research. And we will have at least one or two more of these before the end of the election season. And clearly this needs to happen more often. This was one of the best conversations I've sat in on. And so I might reach out to see if this is something we can do again in the future. This is a very important topic and this has been great information. And I am honored to have had the opportunity to sit at the feet of all of you and learn tonight, because this was absolutely amazing. Strategize, get to the polls. We have the power to create change. And I'm excited to be a part of that. So thank you all. Have a good evening.
Thank you for putting this together, Michelle. I'm very proud of you.
Thank you. We out here doing the work. So look out for an email from us. Those of you watching, we'll have all of this information in the email. Make sure you're informed. Thank you all.